This video covers Module 3, Part B, Measurement. In this video, I'll discuss how we go about measuring various concepts and constructs that we might want to examine in a research project. I'll talk about using composite measures, which is really quite important for us in AMB 201 because our upcoming survey employs a lot of composite measures. I'll go through the different types of scales that are available to us and also how we can evaluate those in terms of things like reliability and validity. So what is measurement? We say that this is the process of assigning numeric labels or verbal labels to things in order to gauge some quality in them or indicate that some quality applies to them. So often in everyday language we think about measurement as being where we want to place a numeric value on things. So if we stand on bathroom scales, we get an indication of our weight, or if we use a ruler, we get an indication of how long something is in terms of numbers. But it's also important to think about that verbal labels are also a form of measurement. So if we classify someone as Australian or as Canadian or as Chinese or as Thai, we're essentially indicating whether or not some quality applies to that person, and that's a form of measurement. So that's illustrated in those two examples on the screen, where we've got a question asking for someone to indicate their gender, male or female. When they select that, they're essentially indicating a verbal label. That's a form of measurement. And the second one is asking someone to indicate their likelihood to repurchase a product or repurchase a brand, where they're indicating a numeric value along a continuum that indicates the extent to which that applies to them. So both numeric labels and verbal labels are a form of measurement. As a researcher, what you would ask is indicated on the screen here. What concepts are relevant to me in my research project that I want to measure, and how should I go about measuring those in an accurate way? And that's pretty much what we're going to talk about in the lecture today. We'll use this 6-step framework to go through the content, and I've said it a few times across the unit. These step-by-step processes are very important to ensure that we're both systematic and methodical, so that we don't miss anything, and also to allow someone else to come back and look at what we've done, potentially replicate what we've done or critique what we've done. So that's quite a handy approach to use. Step 1 in any of these frameworks is always talking about exactly what it is that we're interested in, or providing some sort of definition so a reader knows what we're talking about, and that's no different with this one. Step 1 here, we're going to specify the exact concept that we're interested in measuring. So what is a concept? We say that a concept is a mental representation of something. I might have a mental representation of the concept of a chair, or a mental representation of what a house is, a mental representation of what money is, or a mental representation of what brand attitude is. They're essentially just concepts that I have. Concepts can be both concrete or abstract, so you can think about a house as being quite concrete. You could go up and measure some dimension of it. You can think about a bottle of water as being concrete, and we can go up and measure the volume of that bottle of water quite directly. Abstract concepts, though, are more difficult to measure. We have to rely on indirect approaches. So measuring the extent to which someone is happy, or measuring the extent to which someone shows brand loyalty, or the extent to which they intend to repurchase a product is much more abstract. We have to rely on indirect measures or self-report measures potentially in order to gauge or measure that. Now, a special term that you'll start to come across a fair bit if you're dealing with research is this term construct. A construct is just a concept that people have constructed to better understand the world. It doesn't exist in and of itself, but people have constructed this concept in order to understand the world. You can think about something like success. Doesn't exist in and of itself, but people have constructed that. Brand attitude doesn't exist in and of itself, but people have constructed that concept to be able to talk about that idea. So in a lot of research studies, you won't hear the researcher or read the researcher using terms like concept. You'll instead hear them or read them saying this term construct. Now, because my conceptual understanding of something might be different to yours or might be different to a reader's, and we want to ensure everyone's on the same page, what you'll typically do as a researcher is start out by stating the concept that you're looking at, but also providing what we term a conceptual definition. And that's a clear definition of what you understand that concept to be. That makes sure you and the reader are on the same page, and if someone wants to come back and challenge your research, they know exactly what it is that you were thinking about examining. So for example, I might say my concept of interest is brand loyalty, and my conceptual definition of that is the extent to which someone purchases only a particular brand, or the extent to which someone advocates for a brand across time. That might be slightly different to someone else's conceptual definition, which might be the number of times someone, as indicated by the number of times someone purchases a product across a certain period. So it's very important to supply that conceptual definition. On top of the conceptual definition, we also provide what's termed an operational definition. An operational definition is essentially specifying how you intend to measure that construct or concept in practice, right? Because we can measure these constructs in different ways, and so I need to state exactly how I'm going to measure it so that you as a reader or someone else could come back and understand not only what I mean by that concept or that construct, but also how I went about measuring it. When you do that, you're essentially operationalizing or specifying in operational terms how you're going to implement or measure that construct. So a good example of that here is brand loyalty is examined. I understand brand loyalty to be someone's commitment to a brand across time, and I'm going to operationalize that by using the scale items developed in Smith & Jones 2001, for example. Or I'm going to examine sales performance as operationalized by the number of products sold, or sales performance as operationalized by the number of positive comments someone gets after working on the floor. Right, so we provide not only a statement of the concept, a conceptual definition, but also an operational definition as well. And you can see an example of that on the screen. So in this example, the concept of interest is media skepticism. The researcher provides a conceptual definition stating that this is the degree to which individuals are skeptical of the reality presented in the mass media, and they're going to operationalize it with these five scale items here. For the upcoming survey, you might want to look at the construct document on Blackboard, which specifies each of the constructs we examine in our survey, provides a conceptual definition and an operationalization in terms of the constructs that we've used. Now, when you're outlining your operational definition, you'll typically specify the variables that you're going to measure. The variable is just the operationalization of the construct that you're interested in. So you might remember from high school that a variable is some indicator that can take on a range of values, and that we use that in the same sense here. And it's those values that indicate how much of some construct that exists for that particular person. Scales then are those devices or those ways in which we place value onto the variables. So for example, here you've got a dichotomous scale where people indicate whether they're male or female to place value on the variable of gender as an indicator of the construct of gender. Here you've got what we term a Likert scale, where someone is provided with a statement and indicates the extent to which they disagree or agree with that statement, which gives an indication of that variable of interest just there. Step 3 then is thinking about the rule of measurement or the type of measurement that we want to engage in. So I've said back here you could use this dichotomous scale or this continuum here. We need to think about at this next stage which type of scale we exactly want to use. There are 4 classifications to think about. You may have come across these classifications in the past: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. It's quite important to be aware of the distinction between these and when they apply and when they should be used, because the type of scale that you use will dictate the type of analysis that you can ultimately perform when it comes to analyzing your data. The first one is the nominal scale. A nominal scale is the most basic form of scale. It's simply a way of classifying or categorizing people or things, so placing them into groups. That term nominal just refers to as named. So we place people into named groups. Are people male or female? Do they have brown hair, black hair, blonde hair, grey hair, or some other type of hair? What is their ethnicity? We might label those groups A, B, C, or D. So this is just placing people into groups that are labelled. Sometimes we place people into groups that are labelled numerically, such as with hair colour here, but the important thing to remember there is that those numbers are not meaningful as numbers, they're just labels. We couldn't come back, for example, and take an average hair colour and say the average hair colour of our sample was 3.2. That's non-meaningful. So nominal scales are the most simple in that they're just classifications. We can't perform any mathematical operation on them besides taking account and looking at the size of those groups. They are nonetheless quite important and quite well used. So you can think about when we take population counts of cities around the world or in various countries around the world, these are just nominal counts of people, right? Really quite informative. You can think about looking at population pyramids where we classify people as male and female and how many people fall into each age bracket across each of those genders. Again, it's just a nominal count, it's just a nominal indicator, but you can get quite a bit of information from that. The next type of scale is what we term an ordinal scale or a rank order scale. And this is where we've got groups, but they're ordered in some sort of capacity. So instead of just having counts of groups, now we know which group is perhaps bigger or more popular or more senior in some capacity. So we go through and we create our nominal groups, but then we order them in some way so that a rank is evident. Again, though, we can't really perform any mathematical operation on those ranks. You can't take an average rank and say the average rank for our sample was 7 or something like that. Good example of that is shown here in this depiction. What it's highlighting is based on a housing affordability report in 2017, where Sydney moved up to become the second least affordable housing market in the world, which is pretty concerning, I guess. You can see that it's now surpassed Auckland and Vancouver, and it's second only to Hong Kong. You can see the rank ordering of these down here, which very much constitutes an ordinal scale. But the thing is, with this, we don't know the difference between each of these ranks. So it may be that Sydney and Vancouver are actually ranked very close together, with Sydney just ahead, and then Hong Kong is much less affordable, or it may be that Sydney and Hong Kong are very close together. That rank ordering doesn't tell us the magnitude of difference between those ranks. And I can tell you based on the actual numbers what that truly looks like, and over here on the right you can see that the ranking is based on multiples of median household incomes in each of those places. So Sydney has an average housing cost of 12.2 times the median income of a Sydney-sider. In Hong Kong, that's 18.1. So Sydney is above Vancouver just by a little bit, but then quite some distance behind Hong Kong. So we need to look at the actual numbers in order to determine the difference between those ranks. You might think about another example here where we often hear about Coles, Woolworths and Aldi as being the three major supermarkets in Australia. But again, we don't necessarily know which is the magnitude of difference between those things until we look at something like the underlying numbers. So here you can see the market share for Woolworths is the highest, where most recently within this graph, which was December 2015, Woolworths had a market share of 37%, Coles 32%, and Aldi way behind at 12%. So they do fall in that rank ordering of 1, 2 and 3, but knowing that 1, 2 and 3 doesn't tell us the magnitude of difference between those things. So with an ordinal scale, we can't really perform much in terms of mathematical operations beyond just knowing that rank order. The third type of scale then is what we term an interval scale. An interval scale goes one step further, where we've got some sort of rank ordering, but the difference between each of those points is held constant. So think about this type of rating scale here, and you'll see a lot of these in marketing, a lot of these in consumer behavior research, psychology research, or any sort of social sciences research, where a person is provided with a scale and asked to rate themselves on that scale. In this case, someone's indicating their attitude towards Samsung products. We know that the difference between 2 and 3 should be the same as the difference between 3 and 4, 4 and 5, and so on. And what that allows us to do is come back and perform mathematical operations on that. So we can start to take averages across a number of those scale items, or averages across people. So in our class, we could say that the average attitude towards Samsung products was 5.5, for example. We couldn't do that if we just had a rank order, or if the difference between these points wasn't held constant. One thing to be aware of with an interval scale is that the numeric labels are, again, a little bit arbitrary. So here we've used numbers from 1 to 7. We could have used numbers from 10 to 70, for example. As long as that magnitude between those points is held constant, it still constitutes a form of interval scale. Because that's arbitrary, when we put a 0 point, that 0 doesn't necessarily represent an absence of an attribute. It simply represents perhaps some neutral point. Here you can see 0 indicating neutral in terms of attitude that is either unfavourable or favourable. Keep that in mind, because that's a limitation of an interval scale. The difference then with a ratio scale goes one step further to include a true 0 point. If you see a 0 point on a ratio scale, it does represent an absence of that attribute. For example, if we were thinking about someone's willingness to pay for coffee, someone who indicates $0 is indicating they're not willing to pay anything. That 0 is meaningful. When we have a meaningful 0, as with a ratio scale, the benefit of that is that we can come back and start to make fractional or ratio judgments. So if person A tells us that they're willing to pay $2 for a cup of coffee, and person B indicates they're willing to pay $4 for a cup of coffee, we can say person A's willingness to pay is half as much as person B. We couldn't come back if we were to get a 2 and a 4 rating here and say person A had half as much attitude as person B. It wouldn't make as much sense there. Right? So with ratio scales, we've got a meaningful 0, which allows us to make those fractional judgments. With an interval scale, the 0 is non-meaningful. It's just arbitrary. So that applies with things like price, say web page views, the number of people coming to your website, or the number of people making a purchase, anything where there is a true 0 point. So they're the 4 scale types that we can use whenever we're trying to measure something, and typically you'd use the scale that's most appropriate. So if we've got something like gender, then a nominal scale would be appropriate. If we want to place people into higher, middle and lower income brackets, then maybe an ordinal scale is going to be most appropriate. If we want to come back and take an average or make a fractional judgment, then we want to look at interval and ratio scales. The type of scale that we use is going to dictate the type of analysis that we want to perform. Obviously, if we've just placed people into these yes-no groups or male-female groups, we can't really do too much in terms of things like correlations, because we've only got those 2 groups. We need people to vary along a continuum. The next thing to think about at step 4 is how many measures we want to employ in our survey, or how many questions we want to ask in our survey. So often a survey, as a rule of thumb, we want to keep it as short as possible because we don't want to fatigue people. We don't want people to get bored or discard the survey. We want as many people to complete the survey as possible so that we get a larger sample. We do, however, depending on the nature of the constructs we're looking at, sometimes have to ask a series of questions or multiple questions in relation to that construct to get a reliable and accurate measure. Let me explain that a little bit more. If we have a very simple unidimensional construct such as age or such as income, perhaps we only need to ask one question. We don't need to ask what is your income in dollars, what is your income in cents. We don't need to ask what is your age in years and what is your birth year. We know we only have to ask one question because there's only one correct answer. When we've got a more complex construct such as attitude, where we know that it's multidimensional, typically we think about asking multiple questions so that we tap the full domain of coverage, so we're measuring each of those attitudinal dimensions. But also, because it's more abstract, what we want to do is ask several questions so that we get a reliable measure. So if we're measuring something indirectly, perhaps we want to ask a few different questions so that we get an accurate measure of that. So you can think about attitude, you could think about brand loyalty, you could think about product repurchase or purchase intention as being more complex, multi-dimensional, where we want to ask multiple questions. So we want to ask enough questions to tap the full domain of coverage. You could think about attitude, if you've done consumer behavior, in terms of cognitive dimensions, what people think, affective dimensions, so how people feel, and conative dimensions, how people behave in relation to that thing. Right, so those three dimensions. So you want at least 3 questions to measure attitude to ensure you tap each of those dimensions. In terms of reliability, we want to ask multiple questions, and you'll see this throughout your survey, where we might be examining, for example, convenience seeking or privacy concerns, but we ask several very similar sounding questions, and that's for the sake of getting at this issue of reliability. Think about if you were measuring someone's hoop shooting ability in basketball. You wouldn't just look at their performance on one occasion, you'd ask for them to perform on a few different occasions, and you might take the average. Or if you're after someone's weight, you might measure their weight on several days so that you get a reliable estimate. And we do the same thing when we're measuring these constructs such as attitude, personality, satisfaction, any of these constructs that are a little bit abstract and difficult to get at in marketing research. Now, when we have multiple measures in this way that make up single constructs, we call these composite measures. So you can take that from the composite from the word composed. A single construct is composed of multiple composite measures. Purchase intention is the one illustrated here, and that's a good example. We say that purchase intention typically has 3 underlying dimensions: a motivational dimension, a willingness dimension, and a search dimension. So we want 1 question at least for each of these. We ask people to rate their agreement or disagreement with each of those statements, and then what we would do is take an average across a person's response to give their overall purchase intention score. So here the questions are: I'm motivated to buy Samsung products, I will buy Samsung products, and I will seek out Samsung products. If a person is high on purchase intent, maybe they'll rate 6, 7 and 6, and they'll get an average score of 6.3, which would be their measure of purchase intention. When we have multiple composite measures in this way, one really valuable thing that it allows us to do is reverse some of those items. So down here you can see this second question has the wording reversed, so it's framed in a negative way compared to a positive frame up here. So instead of saying I will buy Samsung products, you could also ask I will never buy Samsung products. By reversing that framing in maybe 1 or 2 of the questions across the survey, what that helps to do is make the survey a little bit more engaging for your respondent, because they have to think about the questions, but it also helps you to identify people who aren't responding properly or who are responding a little bit carelessly. So if we know that someone responds 6, 7 and 6 down here, where we've got this reverse coded item, yet all of these are about purchase intent and that's negatively framed, then we might question whether that person is paying attention, because if they're high on purchase intent, probably they should be responding 6, 1 and 6. Right, so that's a very useful way to identify whether or not people are paying attention. Then we might want to discard that person from our sample if we think that they're not. Importantly, when we come back to analyze that data where we've got reverse coded items, and we have these in our survey as well, we have to flip these response items around. So if a person has responded 1, we give them a score of 7. If they've responded 2, we give them a score of 6, so that when we take an average across these, it's meaningful. In surveys where you're asked to respond on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, or unfavourable to favourable, or anything else like that, what we typically come back and do is assign numeric values to each of those so that we can take an average. So strongly disagree would be coded as 1, disagree as 2, neutral as 3, agree as 4, strongly agree as 5, and then we'd take an average of that person's score for each of those in order to indicate their response for whatever we're measuring here. So that's how that works. And that's also why it's very important to pay attention to which items have been reverse coded. So if you're looking through that survey, maybe pay a little bit of attention to how you think or which questions you think fit within each of the constructs we might be examining, and if some of those are reverse coded. We'll discuss this a fair bit in tutorials. Step 5 is determining or identifying which type of scale we want to use. So there are 2 broad classifications to think about here, and each has its own pros and cons, and it's often a little bit of a trade-off regarding which one we use. So the 2 broad classifications are comparative scales and non-comparative scales. Comparative scales allow us to make allow participants to make relative comparisons across options that we want them to rate. So for example, you might present them with Coke and also Pepsi and say, which one do you prefer most? Or which one is better, which one tastes better, which is your preference. Or non-comparative scales where we present them with each option independently and ask them to rate each option independently. So we might present them with Coke and ask for a rating, and then Pepsi and ask them for a rating, and then we make a determination of which is their favourite option based on those independent ratings. Depending on the topic that you're looking at, the choice of scale here can very much impact the results that you get. I included this example of Coke versus Pepsi because it provides a nice illustration of that. When we ask people to make a general relative judgment of Coke versus Pepsi, by and large what we see is that most people indicate that they prefer Coke instead of Pepsi. When we ask people to rate taste for Coke and then taste for Pepsi separately, in the most part, Pepsi typically comes out as the preferred taste. So we're getting entirely opposite results there depending on the scale type we've chosen. So it is important to think about whether you want the relative judgments or you just want independent scores that you're going to then compare. So we'll go through 4 different comparative scale types and several non-comparative scale types that you might want to consider. The first comparative scale type is paired comparisons, which is exactly what I just talked about with Coke and Pepsi, where you present people with 2 options and ask them to make a comparison between the 2, which is their favoured one or which is their preferred option. Now this can be very useful if you have 2 or 3 items that you want compared, but once you start getting into say more than 4 or 5 options that you want them to compare, the task becomes a little bit unwieldy and a little bit difficult for participants. So you can imagine if you're just comparing 2, you've got A versus B. If you're comparing 5 options, you've got A versus B, A versus C, A versus D, A versus E, B versus C, and so on. By the time the person's completing their 6th, 7th or 8th comparison, you can start to question whether fatigue is going to kick in and whether they're going to be responding in quite as a reliable way. So a useful approach to use if you've only got a few options, but be a little bit problematic if there are too many options. Rank ordering is another one that's commonly used. So this is simply where we present a respondent with the options available and ask them to place them in some sort of ranking. So if you were interested in thinking about, for the emergency services, for example, which types of messages are most inclined or most likely to get people to exit their property in the case of a flood, you might want them to rank order messages in terms of their perceived severity or perceived level of emergency. Here we've got an example with people rank ordering their preference for genes, and what a researcher might want to do is come back then and base the overall rank on the responses that participants have given. The third one is what we call the constant sum approach, which is where people are given a certain number of points to allocate between the options available. So a person in this case given 100 points and they're asked to allocate those points among the options available, and then you as a researcher come back and look at which is the preferred brand and also how much preference is assigned to that as opposed to the other two. One of the difficulties that crops up with that, and I guess it may not be obvious to you until you start running studies, but it came to my attention very quickly, is that when you give that task to people, you realize very quickly how few people can add to 100. It may be as high as 40% of respondents don't give numbers that add to 100. They might add to 110 or 120 or 80 or something like that. It's surprisingly common. Another misuse or misunderstanding of that technique comes where people think they have to allocate some portion of 100 to each of these, and you get people indicate maybe 90, 70 and 80 as responses. So again, you have to, as a researcher, then have to come back and think about how that provides a relative judgment. So part of the SONA studies I get you to take part in AMB 201 is really to get you thinking about some of the limitations of these techniques that are commonly used. So hopefully you are paying attention to that rather than just going through them, going through the motions with them. But that's something that tends to crop up. You can think about if you have more than 3 options, and if people have difficulty allocating 100 points between 3 options, how likely or how reliably they'll be able to allocate 100 points between multiple options, such as the case here. When you have lots of options like this, what you tend to see people fall back on doing is indicating a high number of points for their preferred brand. So they might indicate 70 for brand C, and then just 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 for the remaining brands. You know, if they have 8 left over, they might then allocate 8 to brand H. So again, probably not going to give you a reliable estimate, but I guess it depends on your task. The Q-sort or Q method is a method that's probably become a little bit more popular over the last 10 years or so. It's a mix between qualitative and quantitative approaches. This is where the researcher has a topic that's probably a little bit complex. It might be something like attitudes toward in the environment, or attitudes toward public transport, or they might want to understand people's perceptions of climate change or dimensions of climate change. The researcher will typically have a number of statements that they've created. So in relation to public transport, it might be a statement around the train schedule, the cleanliness, ticketing, crowding, comfort, and so on. And what they'll do is get the research participant to allocate those into positive and negative piles, and then for the positive pile, get them to go through and allocate whether they're really positive or only a little bit positive, and the negative ones as really negative and only a little bit negative. So getting a participant to provide that relative judgment in a very systematic way, because you can imagine if you were to ask them to rate these all separately, making a relative judgment about what is more or less important is difficult. So this approach allows you as a researcher to do that. The next thing they do that makes it really quite clever though, and really innovative, is by forcing people to specify, out of all of those that they've indicated as very negative and very positive, they have to make a choice of which are the most negative or positive. So they allocate them to this sort of normal distribution, if you like, where they can only have a few that are very extreme and most have to be quite central around that neutral point. And that really forces the participant to get down and really think about which things are most important to them, or that they feel most strongly about. In terms of non-comparative, we've got 3 types. We've got the Likert scale, semantic differential scales, and then Stapel scales. A Likert scale is one that you would have seen quite a bit over time. This is where your respondent is provided with a statement and asked to provide an indication of the extent to which they disagree or agree with that. So here you've got an example. Johnson & Johnson is a trusted brand. Please indicate whether you agree or disagree with that statement along that scale. So here you've got the person indicating agreement or disagreement, so the valence of that, but also the magnitude of that agreement. So do they strongly agree or only a little bit agree, strongly disagree, only a little bit disagree, or are they neutral? So one of the things that is quite constant with Likert scales is that it always has these neutral points. So they have an odd number of options so that people can indicate that they feel neutrally. So that's something that you'll notice very clearly about Likert scales. These are probably one of the most common scale types used, and we have these in our survey. They usually only have either 5 or 7 points. 5 points such as the one here, allow people to indicate strongly disagreeing or strongly agreeing or being neutral, and then an in-between point. Some researchers, though, like a little bit of variance there, so they might have 7 points where the person can indicate that they're more close to the strongly disagree than they are to neutral, or more close to the neutral point than they are to the disagree point. So that allows a little bit more variety or variance in the way people are responding, and also gives you a bit more variance in the results that you can analyze as well. One of the limitations, though, is when you go too far beyond those 7 points. If you were to have 9 points or 11 points, you can start to see people responding in a little bit of a less reliable way, and that is probably due to the difficulty of assuming that everyone's going to interpret a 7 in the same way, or a response of 8 in the same way. So unless we're interpreting those in the same way, we shouldn't be using them. Semantic differential scales are another type, and these are fairly common. They're also called bipolar scales. This is where a person is asked a question, and often it's related to things like image, so it might be self-image, product image, brand image, and each end of the scale is anchored with an opposing adjective. So it might be inefficient and efficient if we're rating something like Australian designed cars, or poor performance, excellent performance. And those anchors should be opposites. One of the limitations occurs when people provide anchors that are not immediate opposites, so creative and unimaginative. If you don't consider those to be exact opposites, then that can be a little bit difficult for you. Masculine and feminine are another example that are commonly used. So you see people asking participants for ratings of a product and whether it's a masculine product or a feminine product. Unless you consider masculinity and femininity to be exact opposites, then maybe you want to consider having two separate scales. One of the things with a semantic differential that's different to a Likert scale is you can't necessarily average across the scores for these unless it's meaningful. So here, if we're asking people to rate their perceptions of Australian designed cars, taking an average and saying people have a 3.2 perception doesn't immediately make sense. So sometimes they're rated or looked at independently. Starple scales is one that's always mentioned in textbooks, but I never see it used or infrequently see it used in actual research. I think I've only ever seen it used once in a research study. So Starple scales are where we don't have an anchor at each end of the continuum, so it gets around that problem of having an opposing anchor, and it also doesn't have a neutral point. I'm not quite sure why it never has a neutral point. I've never seen a good explanation for that, but Starple scales are another alternative that you might want to consider. Beyond just those integer-based scales here, where we're asking people to indicate which integer or which number corresponds to how they feel, we can also use continuous rating scales. What you find is that participants tend to look at continuous scales as a bit more user-friendly than those integer-based scales, and that's because they can indicate an exact point that feels like that reflects where they're at. So if we're asking people to respond on a scale from 1 to 7, what sometimes happens is that people say, well, I don't feel like a 7, but I don't feel like a 6, so I'll circle 6 and 7, or I'll place a cross between them. And you may see this in your surveys that you're going to conduct for 201. Where a person circles 2 boxes. In that sense, that person would have probably preferred a continuous rating scale. As a researcher, you would then come back and look at where it fell along that continuum by breaking that up into integer-based segments in any case in order to analyse those results. We've also got graphical rating scales, which essentially fall back to being like an integer-based scale, where instead of the graphical depiction here, we might come back and analyse these as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 if they're considered being along a continuum. These graphical rating scales are very handy when you're dealing with people who have language issues. So it might be with new migrants or people who don't speak the language that you're conducting a survey in. It's very handy with children as well, because children don't always understand the nature of those other rating scales. One of the cautions that you have to have with this is that we need to ensure that people interpret each of the graphical depictions in the same way. So for me, this one here is a little bit problematic because it's clearly a happiness scale or something indicating favour. This person here to me looks a little bit giggly, and this person looks quite happy. This person down the other end probably looks a little bit angry compared to unhappy. So if we've got differences across people in terms of interpretation, that can be a bit of a limitation there. So we need to ensure that those are going to be interpreted consistently across people. That's a bit of an issue with graphical rating scales. In terms of evaluating those measures, once we've chosen them, we've got two things to think about: validity and reliability. Validity refers to the extent to which scores we get or measures that we use are truly tapping into what we think they're tapping into. So if we're asking questions that we think relate to brand preference, but someone else looks at them and says, well, I don't think they're truly tapping into brand preference, I think they're tapping into brand attitude, and those two things are a little bit different, then that's a question of validity. So validity refers to the extent to which those questions are truly tapping into the construct that we say that they're tapping into. We've got two types to think about. Actually, there are lots of different types, but these two broad classifications are what we'll think about in AMB 201. We've got face validity and construct validity. Face validity is a bit subjective. It's just whether or not on the face value of looking at those items, do they appear to measure what we say they're measuring? And construct validity is a bit more statistical, and there are different types of this. Construct validity is where we look at whether our measures for a particular construct correlate with someone else's measures of a construct. Reliability refers to the extent to which those measures are going to give consistent results across people and consistent results across time. So reliability is really about consistency. Two types to be aware of: test, retest reliability. This is where we think about whether or not people are likely to give the same responses to those questions if we asked at time 1 and also at time 2. And presumably if those questions are clear and not going to be misinterpreted, then those responses should be the same. Internal consistency is a little bit different, and this relates to composite measures in particular. So if you think about this set of purchase intention measures, if each of these items here relates to purchase intent, then what we'd assume is that people should respond fairly consistently to them. So these set of measures should be internally consistent or internally reliable in that they should produce similar sorts of estimates. So if each of these measures is tapping into purchase intent, then we'd expect maybe people would respond 666 or 676 as in the case here. If it turns out that one item we think is about purchase intent, but turns out in general people tend to respond quite differently to it, it doesn't tend to correlate with the others, then what we would say is our internal consistency estimate is probably going to be lower, and we'd probably want to drop that item altogether. So internal consistency we can get at statistically by looking at intercorrelations between these items, and we want to then axe or cut out any item that's not internally consistent with the others. So that's validity and reliability, the two measures that in quantitative research we use to come back and examine whether or not our survey items or our experimental items are trustworthy. So that's the 6 steps of measurement that are important to be aware of. I think they're fairly straightforward, and hopefully that gives you a good overview of those. For the next lecture, we'll be talking about error in survey research.